So, welcome to the lecture series on early German prose, which is a trial run. I'm trying to combine approaches from linguistics, historical linguistics, a close reading of texts with approaches of literary studies. So, bridging from paper 4 to the medieval papers 6 and 9, but also then linking into the early modern paper 7. Because we have set up in Oxford the period marker in a kind of grey zone, a broad band. And it's this kind of grey zone, the twilight of the Middle Ages, or the dawn of the early modern period, that we are going to explore and actually questioning these traditional periodizations. So my proposition, which I would put forward at the start of this lecture, would be that we can't speak of the late 15th and early 16th century as the Herbst des Mittelalters, as Heusinger has cited, as a time of decline, which is a rhetoric that the Reformation historians have put forward. So it's mainly 19th century Protestant historiographic accounts that wanted to make out that with Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the door, he put the nails into the coffin of the Middle Ages. And neither did he nail. He was completely impractical. He had two left hands, so it's a legend that was only starting after his death. Nor was this really the seismic shift that was made out by Protestant historiography. So by looking at basically the century between the start of printing, 1450, and the middle of the 16th century, by which printing is the default established medium of communication, I want to challenge this narrative of a curve of the Middle Ages down to the Reformation, and then the rise, start and rise, culminating then around 1800 with Goethe, which would be the kind of periodization which you would see in literary histories of the late 19th and early 20th century. And instead, I want to look at this as an exciting time of experiments, of reading voraciously across the rich tradition of medieval literature, picking up classical interests, kind of fusion literature that links Latin learning, vernacular storytelling, songs, and all mixing this in this new form of communication platform that is printing. So I've taken printing as in German they call it roter Faden, a kind of thread running through the lecture series. And we'll have some texts that were purpose written for the press, but we also will look at texts that were written much earlier, but transformed in the late 15th, early 16th century to speak to a new generation of readers. So in a way, I'm looking at literary history from a reader's perspective. So if you were in a classroom around 1500, what would have been your bookshelf like? What could you access? And I'll intersperse it because it so much hinges on the materiality of the text, this printing approach, with in week 3 and 4 little local excursions. So in week 3 in the afternoon there will be the opportunity to typeset part of the Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen on the bibliographic press in the Bodleian Library, in the way thus returning also to the lecture theatre of that period, because if you had been studying around that period, you would have gone to your lectures in the what's now called the old schools quad of the Bodleian Library, where you still see above the doors Schola Logicae, Schola Grammaticae, the foundation of everything of the 7 liberal arts, and also the Schola Musicae, which now houses not music, but rather the printing presses, including reconstructed press that Dürer sketched in one of his notebooks, and which will be able to use to feel like proper apprentices and appreciate the typo as an aesthetic art form. And then in week 4, we'll go just next door to the Eschmolean print room. I know the German souls have been there before with me to look at some of the objects that the Eschmolean has, but the Eschmolean also has much lesser known one of the best collections of printed material. And in a way, it's quite arbitrary what ended up in the Bodleian Library and what ended up in the Eschmolean. Basically, everything that was cut out at some point ended up in the Eschmolean, and the bulky books ended up in the Bodleian. But they have one of the most extravagant early vernacular print products, the printing of Der Ackermann von Böhmen, so one of the earliest German rhetorically shaped prose texts. So a prose text from the 14th century, when prose was the exception, not the norm, and now adapted for mid-15th century printing, where prose becomes the norm instead of the exception. And we'll look at that in the context of woodcut printing and, from mid-15th to mid-16th century. Another thread running through the lecture series will be translation, not just in how to translate in the theoretical aspect of the Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen, but also looking at prose translation from French into German in the late 15th century, which, interestingly enough, and we'll explore this further, is something mainly done by noble women. So the multilingual elite of the 15th century were these young princesses who married across Europe, and some of them coming, for example, Eleonore von Schottland, marrying to Austria and translating from also from French, which was the courtly language of Scotland, into German. Or Margarete von Savoyen, who commissioned another Pontus und Sidonia, who was probably the only legitimate Pope's daughter of history, because her father, the Duke of Savoy, was made Pope after he had been widowed. So, but she was very proudly announced, and she corresponded in 4 languages: Italian, German, French, and Latin. We'll end the lecture series in week 7 and 8 with 2 guest lectures. One will be in week 7, looking beyond this 100-year period I'm concentrating on, but showing how this period still influenced far beyond its time the early modern literature. She'll be looking at a Zwergenkabinett, which is a new take on the Ship of Fools by Sebastian Brandt in the 18th century. And in the final week, Pia Seemeyer from Munich will look at the Fortunatus, which is also a text that travels across Europe, and where we have some interesting English translations from German in the Bodleian Library. This approach of reading in a time of printing is quite appropriate to do, particularly in Oxford, where the largest ever European project was situated in the last 10 years, led by Cristina Dondi of the Italian subfaculty, looking at 15th century book trade and how these texts and their books traveled across Europe. So, for example, the majority of printers in Venice in the 1460s were German who went there. I can really recommend this website, 15th Century Book Trade, 15C Book Trade, OXAC UK, if you are interested in visualizations of how books moved across Europe in that period. And I think it's important to stress this European dimension, because printing has been quite often taken as a nationalist endeavor or proud historical moment by the Germans. Starting in a time before the national unification of the 19th century, remembering Gutenberg together with remembering Luther were some of the cultural unifying factors. So the largest project of the early 20th century to collect data in book history was, and still is, the Gesamtkatalog der Wiegendrucke. And I just had yesterday one of the paper 4 tutorials on language purism and getting rid of loan words. Wiegendrucke is such a 19th century neologism or loan translation of the Latin word incunabula. This literally means to lie in the manger or in the rocking cradle, meaning books before they had learned to walk, as it were. So Wiegendrucke are those that are still in swaddling clothes or in the phase of learning to speak and to look like the modern book that we encounter. And this Gesamtkatalog der Wiegendrucke, which you can access by just typing in the long name as is .de, is still based in the Akademie der Wissenschaften in Berlin, now linked to the Humboldt University unter den Linden. And as I said, it was a kind of national endeavor to show that Germans had the right to write the history of printing, and that they were the best scholars as well. I don't know if any of you have been in Berlin to the Museumsinsel and seen the Neue Museum, which has a section on the history of archaeology, which also shows that German academic archaeology was set up as a counter project to the British Museum, and kind of Germany didn't have that much colonies, but they did it in a scholarly way. So they documented everything they excavated and wanted to show that they documented it. And in a similar way, the German academic elite wanted to show that they knew how to do philology. And a lot of the terminology of print description, as well as the terminology, as you will have seen when working on grammar and historical grammar, comes from this attempt of the 19th century to establish German as Wissenschaftssprache, something that was then really destroyed by the National Socialists, because they've either forced into exile or killed the scholars who had been actually propagating German as Wissenschaftssprache, so that English took over that. From this rather sad story now to the positive things of this really exciting time of experimenting with print. So the text I want to introduce you to today, the Vier Historien, is a first in many respects. It's the first illustrated German book that was printed, and I would also put forward that it's the first book that is designed to be printed. So there are earlier books, you will know of the Gutenberg Bible, but they just take an existing manuscript and put it to print. And so the Vier Historien are conceived of as a printed volume. And I'll pass through my reconstruction of it, because there you can see this is something that is built up in print units. So each story of the Vier Historien fills two quires Q-U-I-R-E, a gathering of or a folded sheet, and it's used to serialize this, and it's really a new format of communicating text. So I'll just, if the last person, Nikolaus, if you could then hand it back to me, because I'll wave it later in the lecture. So this printer, Albrecht Pfister, was a married clergyman, so somebody who had only received the lower grades, like a grade of a deacon in the church, but it meant he participated in both spheres of learning, the Latin learning of the church by studying theology. He worked as a clerk for the Bishop of Bamberg, but also being a family man, participating in the vernacular culture of that time. I know somebody has been to Bamberg, one of you? Yeah. Can you describe how Bamberg is structured geographically?
in the middle of a river.
Yeah.
There's the Inselstadt.
Yeah.
This kind of UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the still very well preserved medieval centre.
Yeah, it's a World Heritage Site, exactly, and you have the Domberg, which is one of 7 hills. So Bamberg claims to be built on the model of Rome. Then you have the Inselstadt, and then you have on the other side of the river the wine vineyards and gardens. And so Albrecht Pfister lived on this island in the river, a bit like the Oxford city centre between the river arms. And you can see how he kind of transforms the vernacular storytelling from the one side, the learning and structural. He's very much thinking as a good administrator, how to organize text coming from the Latin learning. And you can see with each of the editions that he does, that he tries something new. The first vernacular edition that he does, Bohne der Edelstein, which is a collection of short fables, he had to put through the press 3 times because he hadn't found a way of integrating the woodcut into the typeset text. And you can see the figure of the narrator on the left-hand side here is slightly overlapping the frame with it's the fable of the donkey who puts on a lion's hide to pass as a lion, but is seen through and driven back to the mill to pull the millstone instead of marching around his lion. Anyway, so he had to print it first the text, then print the one part of the illustration and then the other part of the illustration with a narrator, which he and this Bohne der Edelstein was just using an existing sequence of fables. And as I said, the Vier Historien are then the first one where Pfister took charge of the text. So he took an existing book, the Historien Bibel, which told the whole story of the Bible in historical sequence, so from Genesis to the Last Judgment, except that none of the manuscripts ever get to the Last Judgment because it's much too long. So he decides to do a Reader's Digest that is sellable. So he picks 4 juicy stories and edits them to be about the same length and frames them with the same type of printing, title, and finds other ways of linking by reusing woodcuts. And we'll come back to this list when we are looking at the Ackermann aus Böhmen. And when he set about this, he was facing several challenges. And we'll test some of it ourselves when we go to the print workshop. Typesetting German isn't that easy because, as you know, if you want to type German with an English keyboard, you have to remember shortcuts for the umlauts or the SZ. So in the same way, he had to find ways of typesetting German with a Latin font set designed for Latin. Then the artistic challenge of how to combine woodcuts and movable type, and to make it not haphazard. Again, something you can think about if you want to produce a good-looking PowerPoint slide, how to place the image that it interacts logically with the text. And then, obviously, the literary challenge, how to edit the text to allow for marketable set of text. Here for the technical challenge, I've marked in red letters that are missing for German. So he didn't have capital W and capital Z. There was small z because there are few Latin loan words from Greek that use z, but Latin didn't need a capital Z. So if the first line reading here, dem Büchlein ist sein Ende geben zu Bamberg. Zu would require a capital Z, which he didn't have. So he used a capital C and then added a small z. In a way, like you use nowadays TZ for the same sound. The umlauts he just discarded, and for the sometimes he didn't put in capitals where they would normally be required, like in the one, which I've put on the bottom of the slide, where he just put a small W. Then the artistic challenge. So there wasn't really an established way of integrating woodcuts into text. So you've either cut the whole the text into the wood for block books, or you hand wrote both text and painted them. So there isn't an established convention. You know, if any of you have read mangas in translation, you have to read them from back to front, of at least the reading direction of the illustrations is from right to left. While then from the later 15th century it became established to have woodcuts that would read from left to right, so to coincide with the reading direction as you went through the text. The medieval convention of representing things was rather to have it as set out on a stage. So if any of you have been to the medieval mystery cycle, like we did last year, so the medieval stage was organized in loca, places. So each group of people, like there would be Pilate's house in the middle, there would be the temple on one side, or heaven on one side, hell on the other side. And in the same way, Pfister decides to design the woodcuts for a reading audience that is used to having this action presented to them place specific. So on the left-hand side, it's always Holofernes, the baddie. On the right-hand side, it's always Judas, the goodie. And they interact between these two sides. You have here Judith setting out from home to the camp of Holofernes to kill the enemy from right to left, which is then changed after the period of Wiegendruck. So once this kind of childhood phase is over, the convention has changed. So she is setting out from the right and she is returning to the right. While in a modern, if you read Asterix, that is meant for European readership, you read with Asterix. Asterix always comes from the left to go out and fight the Romans. This means that for a modern readership, or even for a 16th century readership, this would be slightly irritating. The simultaneous presentation of the truncated body of Holofernes on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, he's sitting blonde and rosy-cheeked, having dinner with Judith. So, and that's because his tent just has to be on the left-hand side if you present it like a stage. Pfister used the repetition of scenes partly to save money, if you can have the same woodcut indicating several scenes, but partly also to show the unity of his newly made up book, in that he has for stock scenes, stock images. And again, if you think of Asterix, where you always end with a bard being tied to the tree, and then you know the book is over. And so you have, at each time that there is a banquet, the same woodcut, even though in the top left-hand corner, Judith eating her meal with Holofernes, it doesn't really fit because Judith shouldn't have a crown. But it's more important to indicate at which point of the story we are, and also that there are recognizable patterns that link all four stories together. And that's made even more pertinent by having the same heading for each of the four stories. This seems to be just such a short text, or right, a kind of non-text, just hier hebt sich an die Historie von Joseph. So here starts the story of Joseph. But it's a real innovation because you didn't have any models for how to start a printed text. So there aren't convention for title pages, there aren't convention of how you frame a story. And we'll come back to the term history, from Latin historia, which means both history and story. In English, it's interesting because the same Latin word was imported as a loan word twice in different phases of the English language. So you can differentiate while you don't have this opportunity in German where you just have once imported Historia. or then Germanized Historie, but both meaning a very specific thing. And then the final thing he does is to link the stories together. He transplants elements of the one story into another story. So he takes the first chapter of the book of Judith and puts it at the end of Daniel, so that it seems to be a natural progression from one to the next. I should probably tell you the story of Judith, and the problem with that is I've written my Habilitation on Judith, and once I start it, we would be here until tonight, and we need the time for Nikolaus Ruge. So I'll try to make it very, very short, but if any of you want to ask me about it, I'm more than happy to elaborate about Judith. Basically, the book of Judith was written in the 2nd century BC as a moral story, combining elements of the history of the people of Israel into one parable. So the name Judith just means the Jewish woman. The name of the town where she is, Betulia, just means the house of God. She is a widow because that is the quintessential vulnerable person. And if she can slay the worst enemy and the army, then everybody can do that. Just trust in God. So the moral of the story is, via faith you can conquer everybody. And her enemy is Holofernes, who is the Duke of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is presented as the king of the Assyrians, which is about as if I were to tell you, so Napoleon, the king of the Austrians, attacked Germany. So it was at the time of writing very clear that this wasn't a historical account. It was a worst case scenario put together to show with God's help everything can be overcome. And it's a well-written, quite punchy story. So Judith, so Nebuchadnezzar threatens Israel. He has conquered the whole world, nearly all Israel, not all Israel. One village is withstanding. I'm pretty sure, actually, Goskini has read the book of Judith when he wrote Asterix. And the village is about to give up because the army is so big. When Judith comes forward and says, just trust in God and it all will be fine, she dresses up, goes into the camp of the enemy and says, I have a secret to tell you. God will make the worthy conquer in the end. And Holofernes, of course, thinks that's him who will be able to conquer the village, and says, just tell me what to do. And Judith says, I need to be able to leave as I like to my prayers and speak to God, and then I can convey his messages to you, and everything will turn out well. She doesn't say it will turn out well for you. That's what he thinks. She knows it will turn out well for Israel. And he falls in love with her, makes a big feast. She makes sure he gets drunk. He retreats to his tent. She follows him. Everybody leaves them alone. She takes his own sword. takes off his head, put it in the bag with kosher food she had brought with her, marches out of the camp. They put his head on a pike and march out head foremost. So Holofernes is conquering at the end, but not in the way he had imagined. Everybody, the whole army of the Assyrians scatter. The Israeli village gets all the goods from the camp, and they celebrate a big feast, and Judith sings a song, which is a kind of shortened psalm verse. So this is a story that was well loved in the Middle Ages, one of the most retold stories, and also part of the retelling in the form of the Historien Bibel. And the Historien Bibel were ways of adapting the Bible into German in a way that you weren't bound to the literal text. So as those who have studied Luther's Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen will know, he criticizes the word-for-word translation of the Bible that was done in the previous German Bible translations. But what he doesn't mention was that most people wouldn't read the German Bible translation. They would rather read as you would read the kind of children's version of biblical stories. So the flood retold in popular language. So they would read these Historien Bibel that paraphrase and embellish the text. And they had tackled the story of Judith and made it, adapted it already for medieval German readership. So in the Vulgate, it's said that when Judith left the town with her kosher food in the bag, she put in there a wineskin, ascopera, which is so how you would transport drink in antiquity by putting it into a skin, and she took with her vas olei, a container of oil, and then palatas, which is something polenta style, so corn flour and dry figs and bread, so a Mediterranean diet that confirms to Jewish laws of kosher food. And the Bible translations had to stick with that. So Luther has in 1545 gab ihrer Magd ein gepichte Haut voll Wein. Gepicht is from pech, so tar. I'm not quite sure how you would say it. I just put in tar-proofed. So if you kind of insulate the skin inside by it's something you do also with ships to put the planks together. Any better word for that? How would you use tarred planks? Anyway, it's something quite foreign to a German audience to have a gepichte Haut voll Wein as the thing you take. So the historian Bibel just makes it much more accessible to the German audience by saying, sie leiht ihr auf ihr Dirnen ein Lägulin mit Wien uf und ein Fass mit Öl und ein Kocht mit Lampen und Brot und Käs und gingen zu der Stadtporten. And you can see in the illustration of the historian Bibel that Pfister was really taking his text as a literal inspiration. So you see the maidservant balancing a little wine barrel as it would have been built in Bamberg, a beer brewing a city that had lots of barrels around. I think it's still fairly awkward to carry, but it's not as useful for transporting a head back, but the provisions are better understandable. So in the Vier Historien you have the same text as in the Historienbibel, und legt Irradieren ein Lägelen mit Wein auf und ein Fass mit Öle und gekocht von Lämmern und Brot und Käs und gingen zu der Stadtpforten. I've given you a bit more text on your handout. I won't go through all of it, but it's an interesting exercise. Also, for the paper 4, if you want to see the vowel changes from Middle High German to early New High German, you can really put the Historienbibel next to the Vier Historien, and you'll see all these shifts. Another reason for Pfister to take not the biblical translation, but rather the retelling and paraphrasing of the Historienbibel was that it gets across how love-stricken Holofernes is in a much nicer way. So the Vulgate talks about Holofernes being concussum, like you have a concussed head through his concupiscentia, his very negatively connotated form of desire, actually one of the deadly sins to be sorry. And the first printed German Bible keeps that and says, ward brinnen in ihr Begehrung. And Luther also has this negative connotated version, denn war entzündet mit Brunst gegen ihr. Brunst is something that otherwise is the love of animals. So when they have, when dogs are I'm not sure about the English word, kind of läufig, they are brünstig. So while the Historienbibel has und stund auf und ging zu ihm und stund für sein Angesicht, du was Holofernes Herz voll Freuden und was in brennender Minn gegen ihr. So they take the language of courtly love and get the kind of love interest into the whole thing. Und sprach, trink und iss und sitz in Freuden, wann du hast Gnad vor mir funden. also keeps the suspension longer, who is going to be the baddie and so on. Pfister keeps that, but he even takes it one step further. Instead of the brennen, burning, which can be negative or positive, he puts in: und stund auf und ging zu ihm und stund für sein Angesicht. Du warst Holofernes Herz voller Freuden und was in blühender Minne gegen ihr. So P is at the beginning of a word is typical for the dialect of the region in Bamberg, where you have between the plosives, the voiced and unvoiced mixed up. So in standard New High German it would be blühend with a B. So flowering love, even made more positive. Trink und iss und sitz in Freuden, du hast Gnad vor mir funden. We are nearly at the end, but I want to read you the final poem, which is Pfister's addition to the 4 stories and brings the 4 stories together, and where he gives his reason for putting this book together. Ein edlich Mensch von Herzen gehrt, dass wer weiß und wohlgelehrt. Ahn, Meister und Schrift, das nit mag sein, so können wir all auch nit Latein. I think that's probably true for many of us. Darauf han ich ein Teil gedacht und 4 Historie zusammenbracht. Josef, Daniel und auch Judith und Esther auch, mit gutem Sitt. Die 4 hätt Gott in seiner Hut, als noch je den Guten tut. Dadurch wir bessern unser Leben. Bessern again, Bamberg verbessern. Dem Büchlein ist sein Ende geben zu Bamberg in derselben Stadt, das Albrecht Pfister gedrucket hat. Du man zahlt 1400 Jahr im 62. Das ist wahr. Nicht lang nach Sandwald-Purgentag, die uns wohl Gnad erberben mag. Here he had run out of his W's because, as I said, W isn't a letter that's normally necessary in Latin except for a few loan words. So he just put in a B, which is close enough, so the plosive at the same way as the W fricative. Fried und das ewig Leben, das wolle uns Gott allen geben. Amen. So I'll stop the recording at this point.